today is we're going to talk about technology tools that we can use to manage putting surface quality, consistency, and then talk about some of the implications that has in terms of disease management. And one of the things that I think is changing, and John Kaminsky touched on it a little bit in his presentation at the end, is the impact of all the various tools and pieces of technology that we have, as well as the use of the various tools, both digital devices like our mobile phones and tablets and so on, but also the tools that you have access to for fairly low cost now. So Bill, I'm on the second slide now, if you would switch to that, thanks. So ultimately, anything that we do to manage our putting surfaces, that we can use some of this technology to get a better idea, which is kind of portrayed in that second picture of really good, solid data about what's going on our surfaces. That's going to play a role in how we do a better job of managing disease. Gives us an opportunity to think about, is there an area that's always a problem that we can spot spray? We can collect that data, look at it over time, and see trends. So those are some things to think about, ultimately with the goal, like in the right picture, of having that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So the third slide there, Bill. I'm in an area in Knoxville that's right smack in the heart of the transition zone, which is kind of that green band there that you see. And the real challenge to growing grass in that transition zone is the fact that as you move farther south with cool season grasses, you reach this zone, and as you move farther north with warm season grasses, you reach this zone. And Knoxville being right in the heart of it, we always tell our students that we have the opportunity to grow all grasses equally poorly. We can grow anything from Bahia grass to perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass. All of these grasses will grow at some point during the year in our climate. The challenge is that none of these grasses grow particularly well. There's a few that are probably better than others, and not surprisingly, those are the ones that we find on our golf courses and our home lawn. But the challenge with that transition zone is it's really that edge of adaptation. And whenever you reach an edge of adaptation in any plant, that's where all of the problems and challenges are going to make themselves readily apparent. So, for example, with cool season grasses, when it's too hot, we're going to see problems with warm season diseases. We're going to see difficulties with fungicide control because those plants are growing at in a climate that's probably pushing the edge of adaptation. So we're uniquely suited in Knoxville to really get at some of these key questions about how do we do a good job of managing our surfaces for quality and consistency while paying attention to what impacts that has on disease. So next slide, Bill. The talk today, I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these things, but we're going to talk about the use of GPS technology and what that means for you as a turf manager, the use of moisture meters, which some of you may be using, and I'd just maybe take a quick poll in the discussion box there if you'll put in a response if you're using a moisture meter on a regular basis, and if you have a particular technique, maybe throw that in there so we can have a look at that at the end. The turf quality measurements that you have the ability to make, which prior to this was really kind of the purview of a professor or a graduate student doing research, making measurements to measure turf quality. You now have access to some of these tools, and so it's really important that we talk about those and some of the tools that are out there. Also, the ability to take all of these things and couple them up with GPS and then bring them down into a mapping situation where you can get a really good visual overview of what's going on, whether it's moisture or disease or quality or whatever the case may be. There's a number of tools that are available out there to be able to do that. And then the last thing, I kind of have a question mark with surface consistency, is I'm going to touch on a device that's picking up some steam overseas and is being talked about in the Royal and Ancient world rather than the U.S. Golf Association world that has some implications for measuring surface consistency and some of the things that we might think about coming down the road in terms of how we manage surfaces, maybe not necessarily for how they look or how fast they roll, but for how consistent they roll. And so that's something that we'll finish up on. So next slide, Bill. When I think about all these tools and technologies, at the end of the day, what we're interested in is what's going on in that surface, both above ground and below ground. And when you walk into a doctor's office, so there's a lot of times when I talk about this with the superintendent, I'll kind of get a little bit of pushback, maybe talking about how they don't want to be replaced, and if all you got to do is stick one of these tools in the ground and it'll tell you what number you got to keep it at, that they're going to get replaced by somebody that can do it cheaper and better. Or as good for less money, and that's always a concern. But the way I look at it is not like the automatic checkouts at the grocery store where you get rid of some cashiers because you're willing to do the job, but more along the lines of the vital signs of your golf course. So when you go to the doctor's office, there's you can take your blood pressure at home, you can take your pulse ox at home, you can do all these things at home now. You'll also do them at the doctor's office when you walk in. But at the end of the day, it takes the person with the training and the know-how and the knowledge to interpret what all those vital signs mean in terms of what's going on with your body. And so I kind of look at these tools the same way. When you put a moisture probe in the ground, you're going to get a number, but the real challenge is to integrate that with all the other bits and pieces of information you have about that facility, along with your knowledge and experience about what goes on under different conditions, and integrate that all to get a picture of what's going on in terms of the surface in the facility, and then make informed judgments about what to do. And that's something that somebody that doesn't have the training and doesn't have the experience can do. So there's no worries there. Really look at these tools as a way to get good, solid information to make information-based decisions. Next slide, Bill. We're really entering a world of big data, and you hear that all over the place. And what does big data mean? Basically, the ability of these digital devices and these technology and the technology and the tools that we have available to be able to do things like what we've seen with ShotLink, where you can map every single shot on every single pro tour on every single golf course that they play on, and get really solid information about what's going on in terms of how a professional player plays a shot. The statistic that just became the kind of the current measure of who the best putter is, strokes saved, is not possible without ShotLink, because that stroke saved is based on a baseline of a distance of a putt, what the average tour player makes from that distance, and then what that particular player makes from that distance. It used to be shots per greens in regulation. The problem with putts per greens in regulation, it means that if you're a really good approach player and you hit the ball this far from the hole every time, you're going to make a lot of those putts. So your putts per GIR is going to be really low, and you're going to be talked about as the best putter. But that's not really the case. You're a really good approach shot player, not necessarily the best putter. And so this stroke saved statistic that they've calculated now, which actually was derived by I think a Columbia University business professor, is something that was not possible without the information that is contained in the ShotLink database. So this idea of having this data and this rich data that tells us all about what's going on a golf course is a really interesting and important thing. And the real key is going to be, in terms of getting it used widely, is going to be a system in which that information can be collected easily, brought in and integrated with all the other pieces of information that you might be collecting around a golf course, and then providing the end user, the superintendent, a clear and easy way to manage that and to use that to make decisions. Next slide. The talk today would be incomplete if we didn't talk about the impact of all these things on disease management. So on this image here, I've got the disease triangle, and many times you'll see the disease triangle with the labels at the vertices of the triangle, and I don't like to think of it that way. I rather like to think of a disease triangle with the the names or the parts of the various triangle pieces on the edges of the triangle. And the reason for that is that when we think of a suitable environment that's on that one edge, or a virulent pathogen or a susceptible host, as Cale was talking about with the bent grasses, the various bent grasses and their susceptibility to dollar spot, the edge of that triangle then shrinks or gets larger depending on its relative susceptibility. So if we think about the host for a second, if we think about something like declaration, the triangle might have a short side for the host and be a kind of a narrow triangle. If we think about a resistant or a susceptible variety, it might have a very wide triangle. So you can kind of see that triangle gets larger and smaller as we make the sides bigger and smaller. And fungicides don't control 100% of the disease that's present. And so when we think of fungicides, we generally think of fungicides as controlling 95 to 98% of the disease that might be present. So anything you can do from a cultural management perspective, using some of these tools, for example, to mitigate the area of that triangle, to make the environment less favorable, to manage your host in a more advantageous manner so that it's less susceptible, is going to reduce the size of that triangle. And by reducing the size of that triangle, your fungicides are going to work better, because the percentage of, or the area of the triangle that's left out of that 98% control is going to be much smaller than the 98% of a much larger triangle. So that 2% that's left over is dependent on how big the triangle was to begin with. Next slide. So we're going to talk about GPS, and if we go to the next slide, talking about how GPS works. If you're not familiar, it's a constellation of 24 different satellites that are overhead in geosynchronous orbit, so they're like 22,000 miles out there, and they're out there at a point where all the different gravities from the various celestial objects balance out, so that as the Earth rotates, the satellite is orbiting over the same area. So that's what we call geosynchronous orbit. So that satellite is always over the same area, and they're broadcasting a precise time code from an atomic clock. And if you have a receiver down on the ground receiving these time codes, then the only difference in the time from any, because all of the satellites are synchronized to the same time, so the only difference in the time code from one satellite to the next is going to be a function of how far away it is, and that signal is traveling at the speed of light. So you're truly using, when you really stop and think about it, the theory of relativity in Einstein to calculate where you're at on the surface of the Earth. And if you receive a signal from at least 4 satellites, you can locate yourself to a very specific, precise point on the planet. And so that's how GPS works, and that's really important for us to think about in how we do this. Bill, if you just want to kind of scan through these, we'll kind of go through these as we go. So accuracy costs money, and when we think about the various levels of accuracy, at the 10-meter accuracy, which is something similar to what you might have in your car, or something what you might have in your in a GPS unit, 10-meter accuracy, we're now down less than $100. These are the kinds of things that are in our cell phones and so on. At the half-meter to 5-meter accuracy, like a handheld specific GPS unit, we get down into higher levels of accuracy, $100 to $1,000. And when we go down to what we call decimeter level accuracy, which is down in the centimeter to 30 centimeter range, we get up to $2,000 plus a subscription that you annually have to keep up in order to keep that precise location information current. So at the end of the day, accuracy costs money, and I think right now we're at a point where that half a meter to 5-meter accuracy is a level that makes sense for an end user like a golf course superintendent, because they're pieces of equipment that we can have that are in that $100 to $200, $300 range that give us the kind of accuracy that we need in terms of making some measurements. So next slide, we're going to talk about how to use GPS to integrate with some of these different technologies. So moisture meters, as I said, if you'll comment in the box there, we'll take a look at those and see who all is using moisture meters. But moisture meters are a real tool that have become very useful for measuring how much moisture we have and then making sure that it remains consistent. Next slide. There's a number of different tools that we have access to. Anything from handhelds where you have to bend over and stick it into the ground, and then you see in that right image there a stand-up unit with a little pole with the GPS unit attached, which gives you the ability to collect a location as well as a moisture reading, and then match those up so that you can do some mapping. And we'll look at some of that. This is some work from Doug Karcher from his GCSAA seminar. Go ahead and next slide, Bill. From his GCSAA seminar on wetting agents. And the key thing here is to look at the percent soil moisture and kind of the differences between the untreated and the wetting agent treated plot. And at 12% soil moisture, which equated to a daily irrigation event, we don't see a whole lot of difference. If we go to the next slide, at 10% soil moisture, you can start to see a difference in terms of 10% soil moisture and the wetting agent versus untreated. It doesn't matter what the wetting agent was at this point. What I want you to kind of look at is the variability that's present in that untreated plot. You have anything from nice green grass to some localized dry spot areas where we're starting to see some wilt, and that's with a 2% decrease in soil moisture, which doesn't seem like a lot. But when you're measuring that soil moisture, if you use a traditional method like sticking a knife in the ground or taking a soil probe and feeling the sand, I've always said that I'm confident that you can tell the difference between dry and wet. You know, it's dry, but the challenge is always wet and too wet. And when we get too wet is when we start having problems with a lot of the disease and abiotic problems that we see, things like black layer, things like Pythium root rot, some Pythium patch like John was saying, Pythium root dysfunction. All of these kinds of things come about, generally speaking, when soils get too wet and then followed by too dry or whatever the case may be. So if you can manage the soil moisture so that it's more consistent, it's never the limiting factor being too dry, and it's never the limiting factor when it gets too wet and we push all the oxygen out of the system. That's the really key thing that we can do with a moisture meter to mitigate that. If we go down another slide at 8%, again another 2% drop. This is again 1 to 2 times per week. You can see that there's a lot more wilt in that untreated, and then finally at the low end at 6%, down one more slide, Bill, the untreated, you can see all the wilt, but you still see patches of green grass in there, and so you can see that there's a lot of spatial variability. So being able to manage and map and take information on this is really important. Doug did just that in this study. If you go down one slide, there's he took weekly measurements on a 1 foot by 1 foot grid of average soil moisture readings, and you can see the variability within the plots. If we go down another slide, you can see the scale on the right from dry to wet, from black to blue, and you can see in these plots like the 6% soil moisture, you can pick out which one was the wetting agent treated and which one was not, and you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in the plot that's not. So the take-home message here from Dr. Karcher's seminar was that using wetting agents helps even out the soil moisture and help retain some soil moisture so that you don't have to irrigate maybe quite as frequently. But it also shows the power of measuring soil moisture on a spatial basis to get a good picture about what's going on your putting surface. So Bill, if we just want to scan through a couple of these map slides and get to the bar chart there. At the end of the day, you want to know your soils, because it's not as easy as for me to stand here and say just manage it from 18 to 22%, you're good, because depending on what types of soils you have on your putting surface is going to depend on how these things play out. If you have a sandier type situation, then you're going to see wilt earlier than somebody that is managing, say, a loam situation, because their range is going to be higher moisture content than you. So as the moisture content comes down in your neighbor's golf course, if he has a loam, say for example, that's the third bar in from the left, he might be getting down to an area where we're starting to see wilt at 20%, and you're well above field capacity if you have 100% sand, say a California green. So being able to know what the range of moistures are on your particular soil with your particular amount of organic matter and managing that and understanding, okay, when I irrigate or I get a really heavy rain, we're at field capacity, and then as that starts to dry down, I take moisture measurements until I first start to see wilt, then that gives me an idea of what the range is from really, too wet at field capacity to too dry where we start to see wilt, and the goal is to keep it right in the middle and keep it in the middle consistently. And as you move along, if you're taking data and you're measuring that, you get the ability to start to see that you can keep those swings to a fairly even, consistent moisture profile. That does tremendous benefits for making sure that you have plenty of oxygen in the root zone. You reduce the impacts of things like black layer and root rots and things like that, which make your fungicides perform more effectively and allow you to do a better job. The other thing that it's done for some golf course superintendents that I've worked with that have implemented this is that it saved them on things like overtime, because they can set the golf course up and know from their moisture readings that if given the weather conditions that the putting surface is going to dry at a particular rate, and so they know that we're going to be okay until tomorrow morning, so we don't have to stick around until 9 o'clock at night just praying that some spot doesn't pop up. And so that gives them the ability to save things on labor as well as potential chemical applications and things like that. And so when we talk about an instrument like that soil moisture meter costing $1,000 or $1,100, at first blush it's like, wow, that's expensive. But when you really stop and think about the potential for it to save you in the long run, the return on investment is less than a year. If you're buying water from municipal sources or things like that, it's going to pay itself off multiple times over. So it's something that if you're not using it, you should really consider doing it. Next slide, you can see that it's matched up with the GPS unit here. And so this is a Spectrum unit. Next slide, Bill.
Brandon,
yeah.
what you talked about the differences in, I guess, measurement down to, centimeters. How does that measure? Where are we at with this unit?
I'm going to talk about that in just a second.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. So you can see when you take measurements with a unit, you have the ability with some of these technologies, and Spec Maps from Spectrum is a really good example of something that's pretty user friendly, where you can bring the file in and it can create a map of your putting surface and show you where your areas are wet or dry or what have you. You also have the ability on the next slide to see you can actually hold the unit over your irrigation heads, so you can map your irrigation heads and then put in the radii so that you can actually show the circles and see, oh gosh, that area there on the right side of the green that's too wet. Well, that's because there's an overlap there, and it's a pretty significant overlap. So maybe I think about adjusting my nozzles or think about adjusting run times or whatever the case may be to try to even that out a bit. This data was all taken with this Garmin 72H waterproof, which is nice, handheld GPS with high sensitivity. This is a level of accuracy that's in that 3-meter range, so about 8 to 9 feet. So in terms of getting really close with being able to take maps on a relative basis, this is fantastic. It's not necessarily the kind of thing that you'd want to build a building with, but you'd be able to get within the ballpark of where you're looking with your eyes to be able to know where you're at. So this is a really good piece of equipment, and for $175 coupled with the $1,000 instrument, it's pretty much a no-brainer to be able to do GPS mapping. So that's moisture meters. At the end of the day, you want to think of them as a tool that gives you the opportunity to save money, improve plant health because you're managing that moisture so that it's consistent. It's never limiting on the dry side or on the wet side. You have the ability to use it in a number of different ways. It's important to select a TDR or a theta probe. That spec meters is a TDR probe. The one that had 3 or 4 prongs earlier in the presentation is a theta probe. The nice thing about those two is that they are much more consistent in terms of their measurements of volumetric water content than some of these other units. You got to be real careful about that because you're using this to make some significant decisions. If you have salt issues, if you're in an area that has salt problems, then a theta probe would be the tool to consider. It's a little bit more expensive than a TDR probe, but the advantage there is it tends to be less sensitive or not sensitive to the concentrations of salts in the water in terms of their electrical conductivity, whereas the TDR is sensitive to that, but it's only sensitive to a few percent. And since you're using it in a relative manner, it's not something you need to be overly concerned with if you're using it in a consistent manner, because you're not measuring a specific volumetric water content like I might be in a research project. You're measuring a relative amount and then using irrigation to supplement that. So it's used in a relative manner. You don't have to be quite as concerned about the impact that salts might have on that moisture reading, just that as long as you're consistently using it, you understand what those numbers mean in terms of when you're going to see wilt and when you're at field capacity. So it gives you the opportunity to make moisture more consistent and optimize that moisture. So let's talk about turf quality. This is a tool we've used for a number of years. It's called the crop circle. You can couple this up to a GPS unit as well, which is something that we have to be able to take plot by plot measurements of turf quality. Prior to the last few years, this has been something that's pretty much just in the hands of a researcher. It's also very popular in precision ag applications, but precision ag hasn't really gotten to turf as yet. Next slide. There's a number of instruments that we can rely on. All of these instruments take a measurement of some sort of index that measures basically what we can kind of put in quotes as greenness. It's not technically greenness, but basically as the plant is greener and is doing photosynthesis and is covering more of the surface, you're going to get a higher measurement. So from a member's perspective, I was at a seminar a number of months ago now, where we talked with a bunch of superintendents, and one of the things that was consistent was, my members want to see green. This whole idea of brown is the new green doesn't work when it comes to a member showing up. Yes, they want a good quality, consistent playing surface, but if it's brown, they're going to wonder what's going on. So the nice thing about this type of turf quality measure is you can get an idea of how healthy the plants are and key you into areas that might be under some stress and going downhill before you get to this idea that, there's some brown there or whatever. So you can optimize turf quality and spot those locations before they're visible to the naked eye. Next slide. There's a number of different instruments, and one of the things that's nice about this now is that we're getting to a point where the unit on the right is relatively expensive. That unit right there on the right-hand side, the crop circle with all the various pieces of equipment that you need to run it, runs you about $4,000. That's a little too expensive for the average golf course superintendent. The unit on the left is a spec meters NDVI meter. It does very much the same kind of thing that the crop circle does. It's a little bit different in terms of how it works, but this unit is several $100s, maybe $1,000. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. And then if you look at the image in the middle with the iPhone and this little placard there, what this is another piece of equipment and app that's been developed by Spectrum Technologies that has a placard with a green area, a yellow area, a gray area, and then you use the camera in the phone or the tablet to take an image and use it to make a measurement. The nice thing about this is that this is basically been derived out of the same type of technology that researchers like myself, particularly Doug Karcher, who developed a lot of this technology at the University of Arkansas, used to take measurements out in the field. And so you can do very much the same thing. The idea behind the placard is that it gives you a standard green, a standard yellow, and then you use the gray to white balance your camera. And that allows you to avoid differences because of cloud cover and things like that, because that green and that yellow are known colors. And so you can use what's going on in terms of the measurement of those two colors to adjust the image and get a consistent measurement. So there's a lot of technology there that's available, and that particular one, Bill, you might comment real quick. I think the app is like $49 on the App Store, both Google Play and iOS, and then the placard I think is not very expensive at all.
Yeah, it's actually only available on the iOS store. I know the Android market will have it shortly.
Okay.
And you are correct. It is $49 for the plaque and $49 for the app.
Okay.
Just a fantastic device.
Yeah, it's pretty inexpensive. And so the idea, next slide, is that it's pretty simple, stupid type of approach. You take an image, you tap on the green, you tap on the yellow, you tap on your image, and you take a measurement, and it records it. You can right now there's not the capability to geolocate it, but it's not a big stretch to think that you might geolocate it with your GPS in your phone or your tablet, or a add-on accessory that gives you even greater accuracy, which those instruments exist. So you could see how these could be used.
Brandon,
yeah, go ahead.
That does georeference the photo.
It does?
Yes, it georeferences the photo for you. When you hit export on the report, it basically kicks it out to a CSV file, which is a common Excel file.
Right.
It will list the latitude and longitude in which the photo was taken.
Okay, but at that point you have to be kind of a mapping wizard to get it to go to a map.
What I do is if you download the Google Earth app, or you can do it on the website, and you just copy and paste the numbers into the search bar. It's going to drop it in for you, and then if you're in the app, you can save the search and append your results to that pin on the map.
Okay, so, that's cool.
A little bit of sweat equity, but it's pretty easy.
Right. Okay. Well, cool. That's good to know. So the next slide is just to kind of show you some of the impact that measurements like this could have. This is a regression analysis from research that we did look at various fungicide programs. And so on the y-axis is the area under the NDVI progress curve, which is the number that those kinds of instruments measure. And then on the x-axis is the area under the brown patch progress curve. So we were measuring brown patch in this example. So as that number gets larger over the course of the season, there's more brown patch present. As that number gets smaller, there's less brown patch present over the course of the whole season. So it's a season-long look at how much disease is present. And what you notice is that there's a really nice relationship that as NDVI goes up, and a larger number of NDVI, that's the normalized difference vegetation index. We're not going to go into how to calculate it or what have you, but as that number increases, that's a positive thing. A really, really healthy, perfect-looking turf is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 on this scale, or 0.8 in the raw data. And then on the x-axis, you can see as disease progress increases, brown patch increases, we move up in those numbers. So more disease is a larger number. And so if we go down a slide, you can see this same relationship now, but now we've got some fungicide programs identified. And so these were fungicide programs that we were looking at with various strobilurins in some key spots in the fungicide program. And what we see is Program 13, which is Bruce Martin's program, and then programs with paraclostrobin, azoxystrobin, and fluoxystrobin all perform pretty similarly, but there's some pretty consistent differences. Some of the programs that didn't control brown patch quite as well tend to have more brown patch, but also showed lower NDVI. So it's a really good way with a device on your camera to get an assessment of what's going on out there on your surface and identify potential problem spots maybe before you even see symptoms or you see visible problems. So go ahead and go down one more. This is a map of a green from a group called Turf Scout that's using some of this type of technology to map greens. This is another way to do it, and do it in a very comprehensive manner. You can see that outer boundary there is an area that's marked as poor, where there's obviously problems, and then you can see some of these yellow spots are mapped as scout. So these might be areas that if you're the superintendent and you saw a picture like this after a greens mower had gone over it, you might go out and take a look at some of these areas and see, okay, is there anything that I need to be aware of or what's going on? So it gives you a way to look at the overall quality of your turf in a very comprehensive fashion, and do it in a way that prior to having these kinds of instruments and collecting this kind of information on a consistent basis wasn't really possible. Go ahead and go down one more. So the Turf Scout takes the info from the crop circle or the green seeker, which are kind of related technologies, plus the GPS feed, converts it into maps. You can use it to document what's going on, and it's certainly an indication of what's to come. If we go down one more, let's not forget about the use of our camera. So this is an image of a putting surface in the New England area a couple of years ago when I was making an internship visit, and he was struggling with some areas. Thought that it might be bacterial wilt. I took a look at it, and having seen Pythium root rot on a consistent basis down here in the southeast, I said, well, I'm pretty sure I think it's Pythium root rot. We took a sample, dropped it off at a diagnostic lab there in the northeast, and I made a recommendation for a fungicide application. So he took the samples, always take the samples before you spray the fungicide, and made the fungicide application, which was a Segway application, and we shouldn't ever ignore some of the more simple technology that we have in our hands. Just take a picture. It's so hard when you're a superintendent and you're out there struggling with a situation like this. You keep looking at it every day and you're not sure if it's getting better, and it's really frustrating. Take a picture and then come back to it a couple days later and take another picture. If we go down another slide, we can see just in 3 days, as Dr. Kaminsky had talked about with some of the Pythium, he had sprayed a bunch of other things and nothing was getting better. When you look at that next picture, this is 3 days later. You can see, Bill, if you just go back and forth between those two for a second, you can just see the difference in how much better the turf is looking just in 3 days. The lighting is a little different, the exposure is a little different, so the green color of the turf is different, but you can see that even in those areas that were nearly soil, we're seeing healthy turf starting to spring back up and recovery starting to take place. Certainly in some of these areas that were larger, those are going to be areas that have to be plugged or sodded out, but the camera is another tool that you can use to manage consistency. So next slide. This is more indications of things to come. This is one of these measurement devices on a UAV scanning crop areas, and so it's not inconceivable that there could be folks out there using these to scan golf courses, fly down, do flyovers of your golf course, and provide you with a map of the health of the turf or nitrogen status or whatever the case may be. Use that map to make site-specific applications of nitrogen on fairways. There's a number of different possibilities for things like this, but certainly a sign of things to come. So finally, I'm just going to wrap up with a quick discussion of this tool called the Greens Tester, which is a instrument that was developed by a superintendent in Ireland. It's been adopted by the RNA as a measure of surface consistency using a test called the holing out test. Next slide. There's a number of different tools, the stimp meter, the True Firm, others that we can use to measure surface consistency and performance. We kind of skipped through. We've talked about True Firm before, and you can see this device here. Again, another device available from Spectrum. Works just like the True Firm device. You drop the missile, you get a measurement. There's an app that goes along with that. Next slide. That allows you to map those values to specific locations of your putting surface to get an idea of how firm or how soft your greens are, and then you can correlate those back to surface moisture and all those kinds of things. So it gives you the ability to collect a number of different data points about what's going on your putting surface and the impact that those things might have on quality. Go ahead and skip a couple of slides up, Bill. The holing out test is a test that was developed by the RNA. One more slide, Bill. Basically uses that greens tester which is a curved ramp that allows the ball to roll smoothly out onto the green. You set it up. You can use it on breaking putts, uphill putts, downhill putts. No difference where you do it. You roll You continue to adjust the unit until you make 2 balls in a row, and then you roll 10 balls from that location, and you measure how many out of that 10 go in the hole. You can test this at 3, 6, 9 feet, which are the recommendations for the holing out test from the RNA. The ramp release point is adjustable, so you can put the ramp all the way up and measure a longer putt if you're going maybe downhill. And the goal is to make at least 9 out of 10 putts from that location. There's a number of things that a few of the researchers that have looked at it in the last year or so have kind of wondered about. One of the things that we've seen and a couple of others who have looked at this have seen are things like sometimes the ball will roll down the ramp and it just seems to kind of shoot off to the side. We're not sure if that's a dimple to surface interaction or what's going on, but the ball will just kind of come down and seems to like shoot out to one direction. Another question that many have is, are you creating a tracking kind of event where you're rolling 10 balls down the same path, so by the time the 10th ball rolls down, there's a path kind of ingrained where the ball's going to roll. These are things that I think need to be worked out and looked at, but I think this test has a much better possibility of looking at consistency than something like the stimp meter, which is the straight rod, where the ball will come down and kind of bounces a couple of times as it starts its roll. And the other challenge with that is that you also see you have a hard time with the release point being very consistent because of the notch. You can lift it up and you know that you can make it roll a little farther if you continue to lift it and what have you. So there's a number of things that I think this instrument has some potential. So I have a movie in here, but I'm not going to play that for you. But basically the idea is if you go down one, Bill, the little box on top of the ramp, you drop the ball into a hole there, and it'll roll down the ramp and then down onto the surface smoothly. And then as it does that, you can measure how many balls go in the hole. If you drop down a couple of slides, this is from a draft of a study that Dr. Doug Lindy did in New Zealand on his sabbatical, looking at a number of different ways to aerify and top dress and do core aerification, and looking at what happens to the green's trueness after renovation. And I think one of the real nice things about this instrument is it gives us the potential to be able to communicate to golfers just what the impact of a particular aerification or cultivation practice is going to be on your ability to make putts. If you go down one slide, this is from a figure that he had in that document, which is a draft document, where you can see with various techniques, there's a decrease in the number of balls going in the hole 1 hour after treatment, but by 2 days after treatment, we're starting to see things come back up to that 9 out of 10 range, with the exception of a few things like the solid time, the scarification, which is kind of a gradient plus a top dressing and a fertility, a scarification only, and a core aerification only. So you can see after 4 days after treatment, almost everything is getting up into that 9 out of 10, and certainly by the time we get to 8 to 11 days after treatment, we're right up in the range where we want to be, making 8+ out of 10 pretty consistently, no matter what aerification or cultivation practice we perform. So the challenge with this is that folks might look at that and say, well, it doesn't tell you anything. I would argue that what it tells you is that the perception that this is some majorly disruptive practice is not really not really all that true. If we skip down a slide, you can see the recovery. 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, still taking a consistent time where you can see that there's a major issue. But it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of these things are up here in our heads rather than actual problems. I remember when I used to practice golf, one of the golf pros I took lessons from would have us put a club down in front of a 3-foot putt about 1.5 feet from the hole, and so the ball would have to roll 1.5 feet, roll over the shaft of the club, and go in the hole. And we had to make 10 or 20 of those in a row as a drill, helping to instill in us that it doesn't really matter what's between us and the hole. If we focus on a good stroke, putting the ball on line, and we strike the ball with the speed necessary to get it to the hole, we're going to make the putt. And it was amazing after doing that, and I'd encourage you to try that and to film that and put it out to your membership, that if you can do that, then an aerification hole that's been top dressed and filled properly and the surface has been prepared for play shouldn't really be that major of a problem. And it gives us the ability to document that and show our memberships that cultivation, which is important for health and quality, is not as disruptive as we might think it is in terms of our play. Let's just skip through the results there. So at the end of the day, what this all means is that we're entering this era of big data. We've got these tools and techniques to map and measure all of these different parameters on our surfaces and on our facilities, and that's going to give us the ability to understand and make information-based judgments about what's happening. But at the end of the day, these are still tools, and you, the superintendent, still control how they're used. And one of the other things that I'd love for you to comment on or send me contacts is, how do we use these kinds of tools to help our students when we're talking to them in class and showing them some of these things? What are some of the things that we can do? We've thought about trying to find ways to bring students out to golf courses and solve some of these problems, kind of as a large labor pool to get kind of a comprehensive picture relatively quickly. There's a number of different things that we thought about, but we'd love to hear from you and some of your ideas about how we can help our students prepare for this era of big data and be of assistance when they get out into the career field, helping all of you out. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to Bill and our sponsors for hosting us today, and be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks.